Welcome everyone to Apex Workshop number 11, Custom Settings. Custom settings are not all that complicated, so while we will take a close look at them tonight, I'm also going to use the extra time to do a review of some of the key principles with Apex triggers, so that those who were not here in some of those earlier sessions can get a review of those and get some practice with that. And then once we have built ourselves a new trigger, we'll use that trigger to apply some custom settings, specifically what we call feature toggles. It's sort of similar to the activate, deactivate for workflow, a way that we can control which triggers are running or not running from the declarative without actually having to go into the code and edit them. Besides feature toggles, custom settings have a lot of other uses. They're a very convenient way to avoid hard coding information into your Apex. You can save values or IDs, user IDs, text values, and pretty much a wide range of data types that you can then pull into your Apex programmatically. And if need be, you can change them in the declarative, again, without having to edit your Apex. And it also, therefore, gives your admins a lot of control over features in Apex, as well as sort of future-proofing your Apex against the unexpected changes, perhaps a field changes or a user who has some specific duties change and you need to get that information into the Apex. So you'll quickly see that these are something that's very helpful to learn. And also something I did not see a whole lot of information available on the community. There's some good blog posts out there, but there's not a trailhead yet on custom settings. And there's also very little on how to write unit tests that check your custom settings. So really aiming to cover some of those edge cases that exist once you start using these, and hopefully fill in that gap in the community information. And I want to give a shout out to Jen Lee. Her blogs were very helpful. She has 2 great blog posts on custom settings. And in fact, I used one of them, the example from one of them, as the jumping off point for our Apex use of custom settings. In Jen's blog post, she talks about using custom settings in the declarative, particularly with validation rules, and also goes into a close neighbor of custom settings, which are called custom permissions, which is another useful way to control validation rules. And as you start writing Apex, you'll learn that you really want to get control over those validation rules, because they can derail your Apex really quickly when they get added or changed in production without going through a proper integration testing stage. Finally, the other relative of custom settings and custom permissions is the new custom metadata. And custom metadata is probably a replacement for a lot of previous use cases with custom settings. And there's a pretty good trailhead on custom metadata. So I thought that it's not something that I'm going to need to cover here in our Apex workshops in depth, since there are some other good resources. But we'll make some references to places where you can use them instead of custom settings, as well as pointing out some of the differences and advantages of custom metadata or of custom settings. All right, so let's jump into some work tonight. The link to the gist is at the top of the chat log. If you don't find it there, it's a nice shortened link to git.io, which will take you into the gist. But if you don't find it there, just let us know in the chat or just speak up and we'll make sure we repost that. And in the gist, oh, you know what, I should start sharing my screen here. Let's get that done. Okay, I think I picked the right one. And it's churning away. And when this finishes, you should see a link to, or you should see the GitHub
gist page.
Look. Great.
GitHub gist.
And what I did in this particular gist is I put 4 files in here. The one at the top is the completed account trigger. But right below that, I did a pseudocode version of the account trigger so that we can get some practice with writing triggers and using some of the really key features or key practices for writing a basic but well-coded trigger. And I also included the unit test for this trigger. That is complete. I didn't write a practice version, but that means that you can go ahead and copy this right into your developer console and save it and do a little test-driven development. So you can, of course, run this test to verify whether your Apex trigger is working. And you can also use it to reference as you build your Apex trigger to make sure that it does accord with the test. Test-driven development is a good practice in where you create the tests first, and then you make sure that the code you write follows those tests. It's a way of sort of guaranteeing that you're not writing tests that just answer the code you already wrote, but rather tests that test the functionality that you want to write, and then you write the code to suit those. And then I guess, yeah, those are the only 3 elements in there. And we'll be adding custom settings features into the account trigger and into the unit test, but only after we get the account trigger working without custom settings. Okay, so what I'd like everyone to do is to grab the code from the account trigger practice file, and we'll walk through creating this account trigger together, and we'll talk about each of the features or each of the functions that we use in it, and make sure everyone has a good, clear understanding of how those work. That's really the key for every one of these sessions. You should understand what each line of code that we do does and why it's there. And if you don't, speak up. That's why we are doing this live, so that you have an opportunity to ask the questions that probably half of the rest of the group is thinking. So with that said, I'm going to go ahead and grab the pseudocode here. And I'll go ahead and copy this into my developer console. Okay. So I'm just going to overwrite the more complete version that I still have in here. And let me get the pages that I'll need up here. Okay, so this is a trigger that we're going to run on accounts, and specifically an after update trigger. Now, if we were really focusing on test-driven development, and perhaps if you were in a organization or a company that just handed you the unit test and said, now write the triggers for this, that's going to require you to do a little bit of investigation of your unit test to see, all right, what is it that we have to write here? And of course, one of the first decisions we have to make with every trigger is, what events is this going to fire on? So if we look here at our unit test, you can see that we're using the @test_setup feature or annotation to initialize our data. That way, the data will be available to all of the test methods, and we don't have to repeat ourselves when we add additional test methods. They all have access to all of this test data. Now, the account or the unit test that I posted on GIST doesn't have the feature toggles yet, or the the custom settings yet, since you'll have to create those in your orgs when we get to that stage. But it does have these first two lines here. What we can see here, if we're breaking apart this unit test to figure out what we're going to write, is that, all right, so this is inserting some data and populating some values from the get-go. And one thing that we can gather about that is if we're inserting data here, we might not be testing it as testing the insert. So that's one of the first clues that the event is probably not going to be on insert. Why is that? Well, typically when you're doing an insert test, you probably are going to embed that within a test method because you're likely to be doing some very fine control on the insert. And the other thing we could really see is that when we look at one of the test methods, this first one here called test all, we can see if we compare the different sections here that we are doing an update. And that's really the clue that, aha, this is what we're testing. We're testing the update. So that's what informs us back on our account trigger that we're doing it on an event. Now at this point, it might be a developer's choice whether we would be doing a before update or after update type of event. So the next clue that we might get from our unit test is that we are changing a particular value. In this case, we're changing ticker symbol, which if we look above at the initial data, it wasn't inserted at all. So it was starting out blank, but now we are changing that to something. So the likelihood is that the test we are looking at is set up to see what happens when that field gets changed. And if we're doing a comparison in our unit test, that means that we need to be able to do a field comparison in our trigger, which means we need to have both the old value and the new variable available so we can compare them. A lot like a workflow rule that uses is changed to detect a change in a field. So that's some ways you can sort of deduce that after update is the event that we want to be working with here. Okay, so going ahead and setting up our trigger now to do a comparison on fields, one of the first things we need to do is a little bit of preparation. One of the best practices we talked about is preparing an empty collection, either a list or a map, to hold the records that you ultimately are going to update. So if you haven't already, now is the time that we're going to go ahead and follow the instruction here to prepare an empty map of IDs to accounts for your updates. So I'll give everybody a minute or two to do that. I'll also type that out on my screen so you can toggle between your developer console and the webinar if you get stuck on what we are adding here. So here I go, and we'll meet back in just a minute to discuss it.
Yes, I did. And she just said, okay. You just...
So quite a few sessions ago, we talked about the choices of using a list or a map as the collection that holds any records that you want to update or otherwise manipulated. And we noted that a list is a perfectly acceptable way to hold those records, but that a map gives you a lot more power, particularly by virtue of using the IDs as a key. And that means that we can check to see if a particular record is already in that map, and that helps us to avoid overwriting that record if we make subsequent changes to it in our Apex code, particularly as the Apex code starts to get longer and longer, and there are more opportunities for the same record to get changed in different ways. You'll also find that maps are very powerful for other things in Apex. So just getting used to them in simple contexts like this is just good practice, so that when you have to use the more advanced capabilities of maps, you already have that basic map paradigm in mind.
You know what, Luke, I just want to add, I think that's it's very easy to underestimate as a junior developer. Why would I ever need maps? Or maps are just for more complicated tasks, or I'll deal with it when I need it. But just like you said, it's such a powerful tool, and you'll find that if you know how the tool works and you understand what you have in your hand, you will actually be able to figure out how to solve problems using maps that if you didn't really think of maps as such a powerful tool, you might come up with really, really complicated solutions. I mean, I've had junior developers that wrote classes that perfectly worked and did what they needed to do, but used nested loops within nested loops to be able to match records and do all that. And you can simply do that with a relatively typical pattern using map. And get to know maps. They're worth it, and they're something that you will use all the time as you get to develop anything that's more than the most simplistic trigger.
And really, in this simple context with maps, the amount of effort to use a map instead of a list is minimal extra effort, and just that constant practice of using them is really valuable. Okay, so we've got our empty map now ready to hold any accounts that we want to update. So now we're ready to move on to processing the incoming records. And we are, of course, always thinking about bulkification, the fact that this trigger can run on hundreds of records simultaneously, and we need to write it in a way that it will gracefully handle those hundreds of records without failing to catch any one that does need updates, or set aside ones that don't qualify. And you almost always are going to use for loops for processing records in bulk. So here we're going to go ahead and start our for loop. And in this particular type of query, where we are comparing old and new values, we're going to use a means of the for loop that allows us to get the same record from both the trigger.old collection of prior values and the trigger.new collection of new values, because we need to be able to compare those, but we need to make sure we are talking about the same record. In other words, if we were doing a list view and editing multiple records from our list view, all of those records are going to go through this trigger simultaneously, and we need to make sure that we are comparing the old values on record 1 to the new values on record 1, so that we know that that one changed. And a very common pattern for iterating through a list and giving yourself a means of doing that is to use a incremental pattern here where we establish a starting point. So we're saying we're going to start at 0, and we define an integer called I and set it to 0. And then we're going to set our condition under which this loop will keep running. So we're going to use the map size to tell us how many records there are in this particular transaction. So I'm going to call account map to update, and then use the size method, which will return the number of records that are in the map. And then the way that we step through those is we use the incrementer function of plus plus, or the operator. And that means that each time through, we're going to add 1 to our integer I. So that way it steps through from 0 to 1 to 2 until I is equal to the size of our map. Now there's a gotcha here that you have to consider, and that's the fact that we're starting at 0, and of course the first record, or if we think of size, we're really going to be talking about at least 1 record in the account map and possibly more. And you could mistakenly put I less than or equal to the size. But if you're doing that, then you would actually need to start this at 1. Because if you think about, say, a collection of 3 records, if we said I less than or equal to 3, well, if we started at 0, it's going to use 0 for the first record, 1 for the second record, 2 for the third record, and then it's going to get to 3, but there is no 4th record in that collection. And there's another very good reason for starting with 0 that we will see in just a few lines here. So the lesson here is that if you're starting with 0, make sure that you're just using less than the size of the collection. All right, so now we've set up our for loop to step through all of the records in our trigger collection. And I see a question here from Lakshmi Narayana about any example to how to avoid nested loops using map.
I was just typing an answer as you were.
Great. Yeah, that question threw me for a loop myself, so I'm glad that you're able to focus on that a little.
Well, I was going to say that I want to answer it to the whole group. So I won't actually give an example now, but I will provide a really simple explanation, right? Let's say that you want to match records between 2 objects, for example, contacts to accounts. And you want to iterate through all of the contacts in a trigger, or all of the contacts in some list, and find out the account for each contact and do something with it. One option would be to have a list of accounts and a list of contacts, and then you iterate through your contacts, and within each loop of contacts, so within each contact record, you will loop through your entire account list to find the account that matches your contacts account, your contact dot account ID. And that will be good if you want to update the account based on the contact, because obviously you can't update an account from the contact list. So a way to solve something like this with map is to create a map of account ID to the account, and then you only need to iterate through the contact list, and using the map contains key method, you can find out the right account without having to loop through another list, and essentially avoid a nested loop in that way. Now, nested loops are something that is, in general, I don't know if a more advanced computer science class would go through something called, oh crap, I forgot the term.
Resource consumption?
No, it's related to resource consumption. It's called big O. And that really talks about how when you have loops, and especially nested loops, the more records you have, you exponentially increase the time, the resources you need to do it. So if you have 5 contacts and 5 accounts, it's nothing, but you have 100 contacts and 100 accounts, now you're running your loop 100 times 100 times. So the more records you have, nested loops consume significant amount of resources. And by using more effective and efficient methods like map, you can eliminate this exponential growth. So as you start handling a lot of records, you always want to avoid nested loops. That's a pretty general rule.
And even in Salesforce, where we have some pretty efficient and powerful servers, you can start to see the effects of efficiency or inefficiency in page load times. So after a record is saved, it has to run through all of the triggers, and if they're particularly inefficient, it will take that much longer for it to reload the record details page.
I will say, sorry, go ahead.
These type of questions are great. These are exactly the questions that I'm going to be coming up with better examples for as I start to build out the blog posts based on each of these sessions so that we can really address the type of questions that come up when we're looking at a lot of these various patterns.
And I would just sum it by saying, if you ever find yourself iterating through nested loops to iterate through multiple lists, right? So you have a loop to iterate to one list, and then you iterate to a second list to find the record that's matching the record from the first list. That's a prime candidate to switch to maps and avoiding the nested loop. So I'm hoping that's a good answer to your question.
All right.
I kind of wanted. Sorry, Luke.
Oh, go ahead.
I wanted to add to that too, as a junior developer myself, that when you try to do for loops and you nest the for loops, you'll get too many SOQL query errors if you use the data loader. So just talking from experience, the map help gets away from that. So
well, actually, Bill. So if you get too many SOQL, that means that you had a DML or a select statement inside your loop, and that's always a no-no. So I mean, that's a very good point. I mean, that's a mistake that many junior developers will do, right? And this is a perfect example of this, where Salesforce governor limits force you to learn how to write better. Because in reality, if you programmed on any other language, right, where it's on-premise server, C++, Visual Basic, or any other language, if nobody more experienced will review your code and find these kind of things, you can actually create really inefficient code. Having a nested for loop with a DML in it or a SQL query in it is extremely inefficient and extremely resource intensive. And so every time you do a SQL query or a DML transaction, you actually are writing to your hard drive. I don't know how many of you are rarely technical people, but writing to a hard drive is considered one of the slowest activities in computing because you have moving parts and all that. Most servers still don't use SSDs for mass storage. So anytime you do a SQL query or a DML, you're slowing down your entire process significantly. And if you do it inside a loop, or even worse, in a nested loop, you're consuming a lot of resources and really reducing your processing and your processing time, essentially, or increasing your processing time. So Salesforce, by enforcing these governor limits on you, is really forcing you to find a better way to do what you're trying to do. Right? So nested loop by itself should not cause SOQL limit. that is only if you write your insert or any DML transaction inside your loop, and that's also a big no-no. But that doesn't change the fact. I mean, it's a very good example to say, okay, I saw that when I was doing this, I was getting an error, so I'm trying to avoid nested loops. You can still use nested loops, and there's definitely many use cases nested loops are efficient enough to do what you need to do. But again, you're just kind of forced to navigate to the right solution or to a better solution just by the virtue of the governor limits.
Thank you.
And
well said.
that pause to address that question also gave me a chance to look at my code and realize I had made an error. I was using the account map that we created to get the size of the collection of records that we're dealing with.
I was waiting to see if you were doing this intentionally to trick everybody else here.
No, I don't like to do gotchas here in the workshop. It was just purely oversight. So you actually want to be using trigger.new. That is the list of all records that have been submitted for committing to the database in this transaction. Conceivably, we could also use trigger.old here. They're going to be the same size. The convention that I've seen, just looking at a lot of Stack Exchange and developer forum posts, is that people use trigger.new. But at this, within our for loop, it's not particularly different which one you choose.
I think, I mean, you're right. I mean, trigger.new size and trigger.old size are always going to be identical. There's no doubt there. So you can easily replace whichever one. But best practices and convention says that only use trigger.old when you're looking for old values. And so you don't get used to using .old, or don't accidentally use .old where you're trying to use your current existing values. But really, I mean, there's no, it would work the same, but just a convention.
Okay, so as promised, I said I'm going to say why we are using that 0. So now we're going to set up the next stage here, and this is where we separate our records into the old and new values by establishing some variable names that will alternate between the old values and the new values. So I'm going to create an account instance here, and I'm going to give it the name of old. And I'm going to set it equal to trigger.old, the list of old values on the records. And I'm going to use I to tell the code exactly which record from that collection it should retrieve in this iteration of the loop. So it's going to start and get the record at index 0 on the first iteration. And that, of course, is the first record in the collection. And then similarly, we're going to do the same thing for trigger.new and also set it to I. So now we know that we're getting both the old values and the new values for our account record and making sure that they are the same. One thing to note here, as much as I would like to be able to call this variable new is a reserved word in Apex, and I cannot actually use that. So my convention is to just use NW. You could certainly use other variations on that, anything except NEW. All right, so now we've established 2 variables, each one representing the same record, but one getting the old values and the new values. So now we have a way to compare them to see if they have changed. So let's see, I'm going to try and catch up with my comments here. So now we are going to solve the instruction, check if the value of ticker symbol has changed. Well, we have a clue right there in the instruction that we are looking at a conditional, an if statement. So now we are ready to compare old.ticker symbol, that's the standard field from accounts, and we're going to compare that to new.ticker symbol. And the way we're going to see if it's changed is by using not equals. So we're going to say if these are not equal, in other words, the old value is different than the new value, then it must have changed, and therefore we want to do something. And now we will add our curly brackets for the processing within this if conditional. And this is where we can actually make the change that we want. Now, we don't actually have anything here in our instructions in the pseudocode to tell us, well, what are we changing? And we've got a little bit here that says open the account record for editing and change the rating field. All right, so we know we're going to set the rating field to something. But what is that value? Well, if we're doing test-driven development, we can go ahead and look over at our unit test and see, all right, what should this end up being? And if we look at the assert, which is saying this is what it should be after we make the change, we can see, aha, rating should be needs evaluation. In fact, I'm just going to go ahead and copy that right out of there to make sure I'm getting exactly the same string and not getting any typos. So now I know that I'm going to set rating equal to needs evaluation. Now I need to do a little more than this. I can't just simply say change rating to needs evaluation. I need to tell Apex, well, where am I changing this? So I need to tell it you're doing it on the account that we are talking about here. And because we're in an after update, or particularly in an after event, that means that we kind of need to reopen the record for further editing. After events happen after the record has been saved to memory, but not yet committed to the database. But because it's been saved, it's read-only. So the way that we can reopen that particular record is by using a slightly unintuitive pattern where we say, all right, we're going to instantiate an account record. We're going to call it A. And then we're going to say, well, behave like this is a new account. But we immediately follow that with telling it, here's the ID of the account that we're talking about. And here I'm going to use the variable NW to get that record and to get its ID. So by opening this record and saying, here is the record ID that we are talking about, the one in this iteration, it knows to edit that record and that record only. So now we have done the proper formatting to allow us to change the rating field to needs evaluation. And of course, this is a somewhat contrived scenario, and you could do this with workflow. And the point really here is just try to keep it simple so that it's something familiar that we can see how the Apex mechanics work. All right, so now we have in memory that rating is going to get set to needs evaluation. To be precise here, I should put the comment where it belongs. And I will do a quick Control-All and use Shift-Tab to get everything nice and aligned there. Makes it a little more readable. So now we have saved in memory that this value needs to be set to needs evaluation, but we actually need to perform the update. So earlier, we were talking about the dangers of DML and select statements in our for loops and how they will cause us to run up against the bulkification and governor limits. So the wrong way of doing it would be actually just issuing the update DML command on A right here within our for loop. I could do this and it would work until we try and update 200 records at once. And that means that every time it goes through this loop, it's going to do a new update. And we're pretty quickly going to hit that limit of 150 update DML statements in any transaction. So this is why we prepared this empty collection at the start of our trigger, so that we have some place to park each account record that qualifies. In other words, every one where the ticker symbol has changed. So instead of doing the update here and now, we're going to add the account record to our map. So I'll open up my account map to update collection, and then I'll say that we are going to put record A in that collection. And that gets that particular record into the collection. And at this point, it's going to exit the for loop, and it will move on to the next record. All right, I got a little bit of a mistake here. Since we are talking about a map and not a list, we actually need to give it the key and the value. A is only the value. It's the account half of that map. So I need to tell it use new.id and set that as the key for this entry into the map, and then set the account record A as the account value that completes that entry into our map. All right, so now we have concluded our for loop here, and it will now go on to the next record and keep going through it until it has addressed every record in trigger.new, evaluated whether the ticker symbol has changed. If it has set the rating value field to needs evaluation for that record, and it's added it to our map. So now that we've gone through all of those, it's time to do the actual update on all of the records at once. So here we could just simply say update account map to update. And since we are updating account records, we actually need to reference the values collection. That's just the list of accounts in our map. Values returns all of the accounts that are in our account map to update. So this is perfectly fine for us to just do this here, but it's just a good practice to make sure that there actually are some records to update. Maybe we just added or updated 200 accounts, but we didn't change the ticker symbol on any of them. And so it ran through the loop, and it found that none of them qualified. It added no records to the map, and therefore there's no reason for us to perform an update. So what we'll do first is we're just going to throw in a very simple conditional here. And once again, use our size method on the map to tell if there are more than 0 records in that particular map. And have to make sure those curly brackets are in the right place. And now I can, well, I'll do one bit of cleanup here. Once again, use Shift-Tab to get everything in the right place. And I do see that it's saying there's some problem. So it's not entirely unlikely that I've left out a curly bracket somewhere or not closed off one of my collections. I bet it's the for loop. If I were to look in here, I could sort of reverse my way through the collections here. I can see that the if brackets are there. But when I look at the for loop bracket, I don't see where that, oh, well, that ends all the way down there. Well, that's no good. So I probably need to get that embedded in here somewhere. There we go. Now we have a matching brackets, starting and ending brackets for our for loop. Let's do one more shift tab and get everything aligned properly. Our problems have cleared up. So now we should be able to save this.
Hey, Luke, 2 questions came in.
Sure, I see them there. Go for it. So Arnold just asked, you put the account in there, but not the key. And then sort of answered his own question by saying, so the key is the ID, and the value of the pair is the whole account. And that's a perfect answer. In our map, let's make some room here so we can see all of this. In our map, the account is the entire record, the entire account record, all of its fields. And the ID is just the ID field of that particular account. And because that ID is unique, all account records have a unique ID, that's what gives us a unique value that we can reference if we need to, like we did right here. And when it comes time to do the update, all we need to grab is just all of those account values. We don't actually need the ID. It's actually included in the account record as well. We could actually reference account.id just the way we can reference account.rating. But here in our update, we just need to reference that value because that's all we're concerned about, sending it that list of account records that are the values half of the map. Okay, so
let me let me just add one more thing.
Sure.
First of all, in line 16, because you've already assigned the ID to account A, you could also use A.ID just as well as you can use it as you're using NW.ID. It's exactly the same ID.
Right.
Just wanted to point it out. But also, I kind of wanted to bring it up. You know, with maps is a collection, right? And you define, just like with list, what kind of entity you want to have a list or a map of. So there's no restriction that the key has to be an ID and the value has to be an object. You could have a map where the key is a string and the value is a number or it's an integer, or the other way around. You can have a map where the value, the key is ID, and the value is a list of accounts. Or you can even have a map where the key is an ID or whatever else, and the value is another map, a nested map inside your values of the first map. So there's a lot of options. The question of why would you ever do that? I have actually a lot of good examples, but they're relatively more complex, and I don't think there's point to bring them necessarily up. But you can use whatever you want, right? And Salesforce gives you the ability to use S objects as any kind of entity. So whenever you can use any kind of variable, you can also use you can use an S object, of course, as long as there's a matching between what you're trying to do, where you're getting it from.
Okay, so if we got all this right, we should now be able to run our unit test and have it pass. So I'm going to go ahead over to my unit test here and take a look and make sure I haven't edited anything that's going to break it here. So take a quick look. All right, we are inserting some accounts. We don't have any value set for ticker symbol. Then here in our unit test, the first thing we have to do is we actually have to get the accounts we're testing. So that's one of the challenges or unexpected things with using the @test setup annotation. It adds these account records into the test data space. And since those are the only records that are in our test data space, that means that If we do a very simple query like select ID from account, it's going to return all 2 of them. So now we've gotten the accounts that we're going to test with. And once again, we create an empty list here of accounts to update for our unit test. And then, rather like we did in our trigger, we use that same pattern, although now it's all compacted into one tidy line. But if we sort of break this apart, we can start to see what's going on here. So the basic change we're making is setting a value for the ticker symbol, because that's what we want to test. And because we want to make sure it's bulkified, we're doing this for 2 records, not just 1. And so we need to make sure that we are, in fact, updating both of those records in the same transaction. So that means we have to use a collection to put them together so that when we do the update, both of them go in and really check our bulkification is designed right. So the way we do that is we initiate our accounts to update list, and we add lists add, whereas maps put, a new account, which in this case is once again just opening a record for editing. And we use the ID. This time we're using a reference to the index to say get account at index 0 and giving its ID. And then, of course, setting the ticker symbol. And then we do the same thing for the second record. So we end up adding both of those into that empty accounts to update list. And then here we actually do the update. Now this is a good spot to put in our test.start test, which helps Apex to know that, or helps us as the developer to know that this is what the actual test is, what we're really concerned with. What that's also doing for us is giving us a unique set or a distinct set of governor limits that only apply to this update. It doesn't count any of this previous Apex against our governor limits. So if you really are testing that your governor limits are not exceeded, start test and stop test wrapped around your change is the way to manage that. Now that we've issued that update, we need to check and make sure, did everything behave the way we wanted it to? So once again, we are going to open up a list of accounts. We're going to call this one updated accounts because we expect these to be the ones we just updated. And we're going to populate that list directly from a query. And because we need to check the value of rating, we have to make sure we're including rating in the selected fields. So then we get that query results. And then we loop through those results, this time using a for loop that checks each account in that list of accounts. And then we do our system assert to make sure that the rating field is set to needs evaluation. And then just for friendliness, we added in a friendly comment here to tell us what went wrong if this does fail. Are we getting good audio here? Is everything coming through clearly?
Seems like Morty Roger joined and had some noise background, so I muted him.
All right, thank you, Ohad. All right, so I'm just going to address this particular test. I'm not going to look at the negative test right now because we want to get moving on to custom settings here pretty soon. So let's go ahead and save this, and we'll give this a run. And let's see what we got here on our tests tab. Yay, it worked. So at this point, I hope that you all have also had similar success setting up your account trigger and running the unit test. If you haven't, so that we can move on to looking at custom settings, I recommend that you go ahead and copy the account trigger file from our gist right into your developer console and save that. And then you also copy the test account trigger class and save that as a new Apex class. Because we'll want to have these in good, clean condition so we can start playing with custom settings. Finally. All right, so let me get back over here to, well, I guess I'll go to the developer console, but I'm pretty quickly going to get into the declarative interface because now we need to talk about custom settings. So we just set up this nice trigger, very basic trigger. And perhaps there are situations where we don't always want to run this. We want the ability to control when this is run or for whom this is run. And custom settings give us a way to control that behavior. They allow us to create some metadata in the declarative that we can then use as a configuration data and then reference that in our Apex so that we can make a decision at runtime about whether or not our trigger actually fires. So let's take a look at the custom settings interface. So I'm going to go ahead and pull in a declarative window here. And let's get this resized so that it's reasonably visible. Go ahead and enlarge this a little bit so it's a little easier to read. So custom settings live under the develop menu here. And custom settings at the base of it are really just another kind of custom object. So the best way to think of them is that you're creating a custom object here, and just like a custom object, it can have its own custom fields. The only difference is, or one of the significant differences, is that you deal with adding records right here in the setup menu, rather than switching to the front side of Salesforce where we might add new account records or other type of records. And I've got some of these set up right now, so we'll take a look at these and then we'll look at creating a new one. The first type we're going to talk about is what's referred to as a hierarchy custom setting. And what we're looking at now is essentially the equivalent of a custom object. We can see, much like a custom object, it has a label, and it has an API name that matches the label, and it's got some custom fields. And we can see that this one has 3 different custom fields. And this happens to be exactly the same custom setting that Jen created and gave a great blog article on about using custom settings and custom permissions in validation rules. I'll make sure to send the link around after the session for this one, but we can see that if I scroll down here a little bit, that we are talking about the exact same custom setting definition here. So I kind of devised this to be a add-on to some really good information that Jen wrote up and shared with everyone. And thank you, Jen, for giving me a jumping off point. Going back to our custom setting here, So the way we manage the records in our custom settings is with the Manage button. What we're looking at now is the metadata for this. If we want to see the actual records that exist under this custom setting, we have to go to Manage. And when we go over here, we see perhaps not a really helpful interface. Hierarchies are a particularly useful type of custom setting, but not one that's immediately or intuitively obvious how it works. If we think about what hierarchy typically means within the context of Salesforce, we might think of the account hierarchies, or we might think of the role hierarchies. And both of those are pretty good examples of what the custom setting hierarchy is talking about. It's a hierarchy of different values that this custom setting can hold. And those the levels of the hierarchy are the organization level. So that means basically everyone in your Salesforce org. But then the lower levels of the hierarchy allow us to create settings specific to a profile or even specific to a user. So here I'm going to create a new record in our custom setting. We can see that it has provided us with the 3 custom fields. And it has this somewhat unhelpfully named location field. And all that is saying is which level of the hierarchy. Where is this located in the hierarchy? And it gives us a choice of setting profile or user. Organization, there's only one of them, so it's at the top of the level. But we can define additional levels underneath that with profiles and users. I'm going to go ahead and select the user in this case. And I will add my second Developer Edition user. And I'll go ahead and check off that box and go ahead and save this record. And when I choose back to list here, that takes us into that Manage Records interface for our custom setting. So what we're kind of seeing now is a expanded information about our organization level, which is really just another record in this. And then less detail here about the lower levels, the one that's set for profiles and the one that's set for users. So it's not one of the better designed interfaces, but hopefully after tonight, you'll get a chance to set this up, and when you do need to use it, you'll have at least gone through it once before. So what we've now created is some configuration variables that Apex, or really the whole underlying engine of Salesforce, can use to evaluate what type of user is running a particular transaction and which custom settings apply to them. So if the user that runs a transaction happens to be this user called test user, it's going to apply whatever field values exist in this record. If the user is a system administrator, it's going to apply the checkbox values that exist in this record. And if neither of those apply, if it's neither a system administrator or it's not test user, it's just going to use the default organization level value. So hierarchies are a particularly powerful way to get different configuration for different users within your org. One of the classic examples that Salesforce uses to say when this is useful is a scenario where you have different salespeople and they are able to apply different discount percentages to their pricing. So a junior salesperson might only be able to give a discount of 5%, or a senior salesperson can give a discount of 15%. And you want to be able to dynamically pull in that percentage to calculate it into a formula field, perhaps, on a record. And so you'd be able to set those different users in here and give them each a distinct discount percentage that they can use. And I would refer you over to some of the blogs that I will send around after our meeting to take a look at that use case. But tonight we want to focus on how to use these as a feature toggle in Apex.
Look, I just want to stop for a quick note.
Okay.
I really do love custom settings, especially hierarchy ones, because just like you said, they allow me to create unique settings for different users in my organization. So I have a blog post, and I'll give you the link to share later as well. But one of the things that I like to do is create something I call master switches, and that allows me to be able to turn on and off workflows or triggers or process flows or validation rules right from a custom setting. So just by including a small snippet in your validation rule, for example, you can actually make sure that you can turn validation rules on or off to specific users, for example. And of course, that's pretty much what you're going to show now for triggers, but very powerful. Custom settings are very powerful for a declarative side as well as developer. And
we'll see a good example of that when we take a look at the other type of custom setting. This is the hierarchy, and we'll take a look at the list ones that are particularly useful for switches, or I call them toggles. But we'll get to that in a little bit, because right now we're going to take a look at how we reference this particular custom setting in our Apex code. And let's go back over to our developer console. Now, before I do that, let me just remind everybody of the API names that we're working with here. And one of the things you'll quickly discover when working with custom settings is that navigating in them is a little bit lacking. It'd be really nice if I could back up to the custom setting metadata definition from this manage view right here, but I can't. All I can do is go back down to custom settings and once again find my org exceptions custom setting, click on that. Okay, and now we're back at the metadata definition. So to remind ourselves, the name of the custom setting object is org_exceptions _C. And the field names are similarly underscored and finalized with that C to designate it's a custom field. So armed with that information, let's go back to our developer console. So now, if we want to be able to determine what user is running the update on accounts, and perhaps system admins, we do not need to set rating to needs evaluation. We're going to set up a way that we can just bypass them directly. And it'll ignore the code within this. So the way we need to do this is, of course, if we're talking about doing it under different conditions, is to use an if condition. And that means we're going to wrap our code block in yet another conditional here. So first I'll just go ahead and take care of getting the curly brackets in the right place and tidying up my indentation. So I've blocked off this entire block here where we check ticker symbol and we make the update to the rating field, because this is the section that I want to dynamically decide whether or not this is going to happen depending on what user runs it. And I need to put that condition in our if statement right here. And I do that by calling that custom setting, org exceptions _C. I think I got an extra underscore there. Okay. So I start by saying, all right, Apex, go out and look for a custom setting called org exceptions _C. Now, custom settings are distinct from custom objects in that they have special methods that we can use on them. And these are all defined nicely with good examples in the Apex documentation. And the one that we're going to use first is our get_org defaults. So if we think back to the metadata page that we were looking at for that, here on Manage, it's referring to the organization default. So that means if we use that get_org defaults method, it's only going to return these particular values here. And it's not going to care about whether it's a system administrator or that it's the test user specifically. So in this case, it's really an all or nothing proposition as to whether it runs. Because every user is in our organization and every profile is in our organization. We'll take a look at a little more granular after we do this sort of all or nothing variation here. So now when we choose get_org defaults, it actually just returns all of those fields that are there. So not just the bypass triggers, but also the bypass validation rules field and the validation rules field. So we need to specifically say that we want the bypass triggers field. So now it has reached into that custom settings. It's gotten all of the fields from that. And now it's chosen that one specific field to include in our if condition. Since that field is a checkbox, it's either going to be true or false. And that means that we are satisfying the expected behavior of an if condition, that we are feeding it a true or false value. And since we had that bypass triggers checkbox set to true in our org defaults, that means that this is going to return true. So at this point, it's saying, if this is true, then run this code. So we pretty much haven't changed anything. This is always going to be true because every user is in the organization. So at this point, this should run just fine, just the same as it did before. And if we go over to our declarative and try this on an account, let me open up accounts here. And find one that I haven't monkeyed with already. So here's an account. We can see that the rating field is set to warm right now. And our expected behavior is that if I change this ticker symbol, maybe their ticker symbol has been changed to GHRX. When I save this, I'm expecting that this will change from warm to needs evaluation. And bang, there it happens. But if we wanted to be able to change that behavior without changing our apex, now we can simply go over to our custom setting and edit the org default value and set bypass triggers to false. That means here in our code, this condition is now going to be false, and it's going to ignore everything in this if conditions bracket. So it's going to ignore all of this. And let's make sure that that is in fact what's happening. And we'll go back and we'll try this once again with an account. Let me go ahead and set that back to warm. And we'll go ahead and edit this one more time. We'll just add in an L to that. And now when we save this, that rating doesn't change. So we've just given ourselves a really easy way to turn that particular block of code on and off without actually changing the code itself. That means we don't have to make the change in a sandbox, deploy that to production, and go through all of those extra steps. We can just do this in production if for some reason we need to disable this particular functionality. Now, of course, doing this at the default org level means that we're doing this for everybody, when really, maybe we just don't want this to happen for the test user. Maybe we want that particular user, maybe they're the person who is responsible for making those changes, and they're the one who does the evaluation that we're calling for. So we're going to now change this such that the only person this applies to is the test user. So I just restored this to the organization, so that means everybody in the organization will go through that trigger. And I better see what we have in system admin. Yep, all right, so system admins conceivably could change it, but we want them to also qualify for that trigger. And the only one that doesn't have it will be our user. So now that we've sort of taken this custom setting to the next level, so to speak, in hierarchy terms, we need to go ahead and adapt our code, because right now it's just getting the org defaults. It's only looking for this information here. It's not actually evaluating which user. So we're going to have to modify this a little bit in our Apex so that it will now know to evaluate the particular user, check if their profile has a custom setting, or if they just get applied to the org defaults. So this is a pretty simple change. We need to get rid of the org defaults. And the other method that allows us to see the, to evaluate the particular user is called getInstance. But other than that, everything's the same. We're still talking about org exceptions, and we're still talking about the bypass triggers checkbox. I'll go ahead and save this. And if we go back to our accounts, so now I'm logged in as myself as a system administrator, and that means that I will use that particular trigger. So now I would expect that if I make this change to a ticker symbol and save it, it is going to change that to needs evaluation. But let's log in as our test user. Let's see what happens when they do it. I'll go ahead and set that rating back to anything other than needs evaluation. And let me get logged in as my test user. I wonder if I can click right on that. I bet I can. Up, and then I get to this annoying page. All right, off to my user details. All right, so now I'm going to log in as our test user here. Logged in as test user, and go to our account page. Refresh that so I'm behaving as the test user. And now, if test user makes this change, changes it from M to P, when they save it, it stays right there at warm. It doesn't set that to needs evaluation. So with this particular type of custom setting, we get the means to control on a user by user or a profile by profile basis what happens in our code. And as Jen's blog here points out, this is something that's also very useful to do with validation rules, although she shows a way to do it with custom permissions instead of custom settings. This is something you can do with custom settings just as well, but she gives some very good reasons why you might want to use custom permissions, and there's some variations on when one is preferable over the other. All right, before we move on to the other variation of custom settings, we want to take a look at how we unit test this kind of addition to our code. So I will return us to our developer console here and jump over to our unit test. So if you noticed, up here in our test setup, not only did we create the test data, the accounts that we're going to test, but here in the, on my screen, I'm adding some other data as well. And I'm adding the data for those custom settings. Now this is one of the disadvantages of custom settings in general, is that the data, the records that we create in custom settings are not available to our test space. So just like I have to create some accounts to test with, I also have to create the custom settings that will apply in that unit test. And that means that I have to replicate what I did in the declarative interface here in code. Now, fortunately, because these are a lot like custom objects, we can essentially do all the same things we do with custom objects. So here I say, all right, I'm going to instantiate an org exceptions record. I'm going to name it exception 0 as a variable name. Then I'm going to tell it I'm creating a new one. And now here is where I actually set the field values. So we can see bypass triggers is set to true here. And if I need to set up a user or a profile, I have to populate this rather poorly named field called setup owner ID. This is the API name of that location field that we saw on the custom setting records. I don't know why they chose location and setup owner ID. They really are giving us some misdirection, but fortunately, the information is only a Google search away if you ever get stuck on how to create these. And then I just feed this setup owner ID a particular value. In this case, I'm feeding it a profile. This is the standard user profile, and that happens to be the profile to which test user belongs. Then I create a second one, and if I don't specify a setup owner ID, it just assumes I'm setting it as the organization default. So now with this, I have set both of those custom settings to true. And when I run the test, it's running as the system administrator, the user that I'm logged in with. So it's going to skip this one because I'm not in the standard user profile and just go to the org default. And so now when I run this, if I've got everything put together right, when it gets to this point in the account trigger, it's going to find that test data. It's going to see that that value is true, and it's going to go ahead and execute the code. Let's find out. There it goes, and yes, we got the friendly green arrow, or the friendly green checkbox that says we have our unit test set correctly. So what I would like everyone to do at this point is create a custom setting in your org so that you too can see this in action and get your hands on doing this. So let's walk through this in creating a custom setting. Oh, I'm still logged in as test user. I better switch back to system admin and hope it doesn't log me out. Okay, so to create our custom settings, instead of going to create, we do have to go down into develop and go to custom settings. And here we click new. And we get to choose the name for it. I'm just going to call this one custom setting. And you'll notice that unlike everywhere else in Salesforce, it doesn't automatically populate the API name. Kind of annoying. So if you do have a white space in there, you do have to manually add in the underscores. However, you don't have to include the $_C. It will automatically include that for you. And then one thing that I started doing as I wrote more of these is I automatically make these plural. I've gotten in the habit with other custom objects of creating them as singular because every custom object prompts me to give the plural version. So by making these the API name plural, it gives me just a little clue when I'm looking at my code as to is this a custom object or a custom setting? Is it necessary? No, but I like those little clues. It automatically defaults to hierarchy, but it also automatically defaults to protected instead of public. Now, you're probably not going to use protected anytime soon, but if you happen to be working for a partner or building applications for the App Exchange or just packaging up applications, protected is a way to ensure that the custom settings that are deployed in a package cannot be changed by the admins who install it in the org. But for most of us, that means that we will be leaving it as public. And of course, you want to give yourself a good description so that a year from now you remember why you did this, or if somebody else is looking at this, they know why you did it. One of my favorite techniques is I just reference the JIRA tickets that we use at my company so that I know I can get much more than 255 characters of information. So I might say this is in SF Dev ticket 1234. And then when I save it, it takes me to that top level metadata view. And now I would have to create a custom field. So I'll create a checkbox. And I'll just simply call this one bypass. And I'm sort of skipping over the added steps here because I want to be able to get you guys onto doing one of these. So now I've created this record or this custom field for our custom settings object. So at this point, I'm going to back off the keyboard and let everybody create the org exceptions custom object in their orgs. I'll go ahead and flip my screen over to the metadata for that one so that you can copy this information in And you'll really only need to create the bypass triggers custom field for this. And if you want to go to Jen's blog post later, you can learn about how to use these other two fields with validation rules. So I'll give everybody some time to work on this. And go ahead and pop a done into our chat as you get your custom setting created, so I have a good idea of when to pick back up with creating some records in this.
Look, just a small comment. I'm not sure if you said anything about that. One of the other unique features about custom settings is that they are what we call in memory. So when you were writing the code, you were just able to reference a custom setting. You had no need to perform any SQL query or anything else. So that is, again, something that's just very useful to know, and another reason to use them instead of custom settings, instead of custom objects when you can.
Right, right. Yeah, that's a big advantage. What a surprise. Jen Lee is done first, the inventor of this particular custom setting.
It's almost like she's done this before.
Arnold confessed that he was on Untapped, or he'd have beat her, which also is a confession saying he's drinking while he's doing his Apex workshop.
I've had a really nice glass of whiskey sitting next to me here for the last for the last hour. Hop knife. I love me a hoppy beer.
All right, seems like we have a quorum of doneness here. So the next step, once you have the custom setting and its custom field created, is to flip over to that Manage section. I'm going to go back to the one that I just created a moment ago, because there's one thing that's a little bit unexpected when you go to set up your org default. And this threw my, my admin team off when they were playing around with these. So you look at this and you see, well, there's nothing here under org default level values. And you might be tempted to go to new and think, well, I'll create my org defaults here. But no, this only gives you profile and user. So this new button up here is specifically for the organization default level. Then when you click on that, you don't get a choice of putting in a location. So at this point, I found that my admins were getting here and saying, well, we can't put anything in, so they would just cancel. And I pointed out to them, well, there's only one organization. So it knows what it's going to put in there already, and that's why it doesn't give you an option to fill that in. And then you just need to make the choice of whether this is getting set to true or false. And when you save it, bingo bango, it pulls the org name of your developer edition or your company's org. And when I go back to list, we can now see that this particular record is populated. And if we wanted, we could go on and populate or create some for users or specific profiles. So go ahead and set up that organization level value. And once you've got that done, we'll hop over to our developer console. Where you can add it into your account trigger. And we'll go ahead and set this back to org defaults instead of get instance method. And go ahead and add that into your code as well, making sure that you wrap the if condition for the ticker symbol detection in the curly brackets. So you have an outer if condition and an inner if condition. And of course, let me know when you've done that. And looking at the time, I'm guessing we might run a little bit long tonight. I apologize for not getting the timing on this a little more precise. Fortunately, list custom settings are a little more intuitive and friendly than hierarchy ones. So we should be able to take a look at those a little more quickly and efficiently. And while you're doing that, I'm going to go ahead and update the unit test in the gist so that you have the information there as well to reference.
Looks like Arnold beat Jennifer this time.
And even before you edit the unit test, you should be able to test this in the declarative by editing an account record. And of course, a really thorough developer would create unit tests that check both the true and the false variations of the bypass triggers value. Sajian just asked the perfect question. If I have an org default and a user level, which one takes precedence? So it's a little bit complicated because there are a couple different ways you can approach that. So if you've defined a user level, that will take precedence for the user if they are the one who is running it, whereas everyone who is not specifically named in a custom setting record will just use the org defaults. That said, the example given in the Apex documentation shows that there is also some roll-up behavior. And depending on the method you use, if you use getInstance, it will automatically detect whether they are a qualified user or a profile or just at the org level and use that. But there is another type of method that you can use instead of getInstance or getOrg defaults that will allow it to roll up information. I would direct you to taking a look at that documentation and the example they give there to see how that roll-up behavior applies.
I just want to add. So the best, most consistent way, I think, is to get the information for custom settings, for hierarchy custom settings, assuming you want to use it in the way that it was generally intended to use, is just to use the get instance. Within the get instance, you can use it as an empty method, meaning open, close parentheses and do nothing else. And that is really kind of the by the book way to use it. You can also, in the get instance, provide a specific user ID or a specific profile, but then you're always querying for that user or that profile's settings. So if you just use get instance, open parenthesis, close parenthesis, what you're basically saying to Salesforce, hey, I want you to find the most correct settings for this user. Now, what is the most correct settings? It goes into the custom settings and it checks. The first thing it checks is, do I have a custom setting that is specific for this user? Is this user named as a location in custom settings? If it finds yes, if it finds that, that's the custom setting. That's the instance it will return as the custom setting that it found. If it did not find the user, it will go to the next level and will say, okay, I have no user. Let me check. Is there a profile custom setting that matches this user's profile? And again, the same thing. If it finds a custom setting with this user's profile, it will return that instance. And finally, if it doesn't find a user and it doesn't find a profile, it will say, well, I know nothing about this user. Let me give you back the organization defaults.
Thank you.
I've had developers that kept using getInstance and passed a specific profile ID, and they didn't understand why it was working the same for all users.
Right. Yeah. It seems like, well, it's because it's doing so much work for you, which is why you want to use them.
Exactly.
So you don't have to hard code those user IDs in there.
This was the downstairs one. Don't worry about it. It's one-sided.
And once you've got that coded in to your trigger, you'll also want to add in to your unit test so that the unit test now can evaluate what's going on. Because if you don't, so here I'm going to comment out the actual insertion of those custom setting records. So now I've got a unit test that does not add in its custom setting configurations. If I run this now, that means that there are no custom settings in the test space for the org exceptions. And my unit test fails. And it fails with, well, it's going to fail on the assert. This doesn't actually give us the reason why. It just gets to the assert and says, well, the assert didn't happen. Why didn't it happen? Because when it went to evaluate this here, there was nothing. It just returned null. So it skipped this whole block of code, and therefore the update never happened. Somewhere in the logs, there's a null pointer exception error that happened, and that's what threw it off here. But if I make sure that I've inserted those, in your case, you would only need to create this second one here, since we're just playing with the org defaults. As long as those are included in our test data, it is able to assess that. Now, of course, if I change this to false in my unit test, we do have a custom setting, but now it's going to break the test because it skips that block of code, and then the assert cannot be processed. And I would most likely add another test method into my unit test here to check that both the true value and the false value for bypass triggers behaves the way I expect it to. All right, so I'm going to make an assumption here that everyone has been able to play with the hierarchy version. And I'm going to take a look at the list version of custom settings. And I'm going to talk about them with kind of a caveat that while we've been using list custom settings very successfully for the 3 or 4 years that we've had them available, since the introduction of custom metadata a year or so ago, custom metadata has turned out to be a more effective way to achieve the same thing that our list custom settings does. One of the big advantages is that the custom metadata is available in the test space. So we don't have to create the custom settings like we do here if we were using custom metadata. And because there's a great trailhead on this, I'm not going to go into depth on custom metadata, and instead just help you to get a handle on custom settings, because it's likely you'll run into them on applications that are on App Exchange or on Stack Exchange or blog posts, and just having that backwards knowledge about what we used to do for the last few years will hopefully help you understand it when you run into those. With that said, let's take a look at custom settings as lists. So I've created a list type custom setting called feature toggles in my org. And when we go to the metadata definition, it looks almost exactly the same as the hierarchy ones. The only difference being the setting type here is defined as a list. Now, once you have set up your custom setting, you're not actually able to change it between list and hierarchy. So if you choose the wrong one at the outset and want to change it, you pretty much just have to start over, delete the wrong one, and recreate a new one as the proper setting type. But where things start to look different is when we go into manage. So here we've got our custom setting object API name and our custom fields. But when we go into manage, we no longer have that default organization level. And that's because the list type custom settings are a lot more like custom objects, in that you can just create as many records under them as you want. And just like a custom object, each of them has a name value. And I'll go ahead and click into this custom setting record that I've named account trigger. And we can see that this has included the custom fields that I have. So in this one, I just have two fields. I have a checkbox called activated, and I have a description field. And I like to put in a description field with my list custom settings, particularly for feature toggles, just so that I can give more information about what it's controlling.
That is a very good practice. I wish I had done that.
Yeah, it's because you just can't quite get enough information into the name or into the field descriptions. So yeah, adding a description field in is a very useful way to keep track of why you did this.
I mean, just specifically having like the trigger name and the line, that is a phenomenal idea.
Now, when we talk about feature toggles, I'm really, in the way I've always used them, I really treat them a lot like the activate, deactivate button on workflow. And I will end up creating a lot of feature toggles. I will use them in different triggers. I might even have a couple different feature toggles in the same trigger if there are different blocks of code that I want to be able to toggle on and off. List custom settings give you a lot more granular control over creating records under them and being able to apply those at different spots in your code. You can use the same one in multiple spots, but kind of like with workflow, you probably want to be able to turn off very distinct selections of code rather than giant swaths of code. You don't want to necessarily turn off all of your triggers everywhere. And another thing that I always wrestle with when I'm creating these is, what do I call these? So in the example that we just did, we had in the org exceptions custom setting a checkbox called bypass triggers. But the way we designed it in the code, it was actually doing the opposite, because when we checked bypass triggers to be true, well, that's when the trigger ran. So it wasn't bypassing it at all. And this is really just choosing how we name things. And if we wanted to kind of honor that bypass trigger name such that if it's true, that means the trigger gets bypassed, well, we'd have to make one simple but very powerful change in our code by reversing this whole block. Yep, Sajian got it. We have to use an exclamation point operator there in front of our bypass triggers field. So effectively, that just turned the true to false. So now when bypass triggers is set to true in the custom settings, when it gets here, it's going to be flipped to false, and it will, in fact, bypass that. And of course, that means that I would have to change my unit test if I wanted to keep passing. So now I'd have to set this to false, because then it'll get switched to true. And when I run it, things are back to giving me the expected results. So with feature toggles, I kind of settled on giving them a name, giving that checkbox a name that tells me when it is enabled or activated or turned on, so that I can see, all right, activated equals true. And that way, when I also reference it in the code, I don't necessarily have to use a exclamation point to reverse it. It's just trying to make things make a little more sense, particularly to those people who follow along after me and have to figure out what I did and why. So I called it activated here, and that means that if I want a particular block of code to run, I have to make sure this is checked and that the code honors that. So I'll go ahead and save this. And let's take a look at how we reference that in our code. Now, it's pretty similar. I'm going to go ahead and take out the org exceptions custom setting reference there. And we're still talking about wanting to be able to decide whether this particular block of code is activated or not. So I start the same way and say I get my feature toggles custom setting object. And then feature toggles, or I'm sorry, list custom settings behave exactly like maps. So if we want to reference a particular feature toggle, we have to identify it by name. So that means that I have to use that map command of get, and I have to give it the name. Now, for custom settings, the method is actually get values. And that means it's going to return all of the fields that I've populated on a particular feature toggle. And then I have to give it the exact name of that feature toggle. So we've kind of set up something where we are hard coding our feature toggle in there. And if for some reason I was to change the name of my custom setting record, that means the code could break. So we've kind of set up what's sometimes referred to as a brittle dependency on something that's hard coded. Fortunately, in the declarative, it would be pretty easy to fix that if we did change the name and all of a sudden everything broke in production. We could just change it back to match whatever's in the code rather than having to revise our Apex and redeploy it. But it is something to be cautious of. And if you have a typo in here, if I accidentally put an underscore in there, I could also get unexpected results. Even if there is an account trigger without underscore, it's not going to find it. So now that I've done this and gotten this particular custom setting record, now I can say, what field do I want? And I want the activated field. And since that activated field it designates that if it's marked true, we want it to execute. I can just leave this as is. I don't have to wrap it in additional parentheses. So I'll take away the extra one I've got here. And I don't have to reverse that with an exclamation point operator. So I can just save this now. And now I know that this particular block of code will be controlled by that feature toggles record. And I had prepared this in my unit test here. I created a feature toggles record, and I made sure to give it the exact same name of account trigger, and I set activated to true. So hopefully if I got everything right here, yes, it did pass. But we can also see that if I had something as simple as a underscore in there, that same unit test now fails down here. So this is one of those first things you start looking for if you're getting errors related to your feature toggles. Check some of those really basic elements before you assume that it's something more complex. Kind of going back to the is the unit plugged in analogy. Check the easy things first before you go deep down and assume it's something complicated. So one of the reasons that feature toggles and custom lists are particularly useful is that you can create lots of them and reference them in different parts and really very granularly turn on or off different sections of your code. So here in my account trigger, we've just applied this to this particular block of code. Now it might be that within my for loop, I'm also doing some other logic. I might have a different condition down here, something that checks an entirely different field, like maybe it checks, hey, what's a good one here? Account source. And it sees if that field has changed. And then it does something if it has. And because I've only wrapped this block up here in the condition for this particular feature toggle, only this one is considered, and the feature toggle only controls that. And I might create a separate feature toggle with a different name that I wrap around this particular conditional. That way I can choose which of those two to activate or deactivate. And there are other cases where you might have your entire trigger or an entire utility class wrapped in a feature toggle. At that point, it really becomes your developers, your professional knowledge about where these points should start and end as to where you want to choose to execute a block of code or not. And feature toggles give you that greater granular control in list hierarchies, or I'm sorry, in list custom settings than they do in hierarchy custom settings. In hierarchy custom settings, to get the same behavior, you wouldn't just be able to keep adding more records under one custom setting, like our org exceptions. You'd actually have to create additional custom settings, which you could, of course, do, and each of them could have a different checkbox value in org defaults. But at that point, you're starting to really create a lot more metadata than you need to, and it is much more manageable to have all of your feature toggles under just one list custom setting, so that it's a place that everybody knows this is where all of them are referenced, and you're more easily able to manage and move those around. Okay. So that kind of gets us to the end here, but I'm sure that there's a few key points I've overlooked. Ohad, is there anything that jumps out at you that I've failed to mention?
The one thing I would mention is that list custom settings are extremely useful, especially in scenarios like what you've described, and I use them a lot in my coding. But unlike hierarchy custom settings, they are not available to you in workflows or formulas or validation rules. So you can only use hierarchy custom settings on the declarative side, and you can use both of them on the Apex side. Beyond that, I think you did a pretty phenomenal job as always.
And it's another thing to note, like as much as I was saying, hey, custom metadata is this great new thing, it's also not accessible in formula fields or validation rules. Hopefully Salesforce is going to change that because it would be really useful. And hierarchies don't quite give us all of the control that we'd really like to get when we're trying to use these in formulas and validation rules in the declarative. I've often set up another twist on custom settings where I use it to map values. So if I have, say, a list of country names and their country codes, I can create a list custom setting that has two custom text fields and say, here's United States of America and its country code is US, and here's Great Britain and its country code is UK. And in Apex, I can use that to make those translations, but I'd also like to be able to do that in a formula field, and you just can't. So we do hope that that custom metadata will bridge that gap for us. Arnold just asked for clarification. Hierarchies are accessible in formula fields, validation rules, I think also in the workflow rule definitions, as well, of course, as being accessible in Apex. Lists are only accessible in Apex.
Thank you.
You're welcome. All right. Well, I apologize for running late on this one, and I appreciate that everybody stuck it out, especially Lakshminarayana out in India. By now it must be getting time for you to head off to work. So with that, I will ask if you have any questions to go ahead and email them to us, and we'll make sure we get those answered for you. And to keep your eyes on your email, because we'll be getting an announcement out for our next session in 2 weeks, give or take a couple days, when we will be looking at Apex and Visualforce. We'll be looking at Apex controllers and how they apply to Visualforce pages. Let's see, and I see Jen just put a question. She has an idea for a custom meta type available. Oh, she has posted an idea for it on Idea Exchange. So yes, let's all vote that up. I will make sure to drop that into the follow-up email so we can add a few more votes to that and hopefully get it into one of these future releases.
Well, just as a side note, one of the reasons that custom metadata is not available is because unlike custom settings, it's not cached. So it's not in the memory, and you have to use SOQL to call it. So I honestly, I don't see them changing that anytime soon, but it would be phenomenal if they did.
Well, maybe in addition to custom permissions, custom settings, custom metadata, they'll come up with a custom something else that will call that. All right. Thanks so much, everyone. And we'll talk to you again in 2 weeks.
Bye-bye.
Good night, everyone.
Bye, Lee. Thank you for the day.
You're very
Have
welcome.
a good day. Bye-bye.
Bye, guys.
Bye.
Bye now.
Good night.
Bye, guys.
Thank you very much.